Okay, tonight's final video is going to take us to page 280, all the way to page 303, the end of 303 starting at 304. So it'll leave us on an even number of videos and an even number of pages. Voila. And the only thing that I can think of is when I was putting the paper clips through here, doing this, the song that came through my head was a Fair and Young song. I want to live fast, love hard, die young, and leave a beautiful memory. And my grandma used to adore Farron. So we got to see him in concert when I was really, really young in Branson, Missouri. Also, I think over in Nashville North, both places. And anyway, we got to meet him at Nashville North and Taylorville again and get pictures with him over there. And Grandpa has the cutest story with Farron where he said he took more than one picture, and he said, I thought you only were going to take one. And he said, got two though, didn't I, Farron? Which was always one of my favorite stories from the times we got to meet the stars. We have lots of them, let me just tell you. Anyway, I want to go ahead and finish from 280 to 304, the top of 304 in this wonderful book. I hope that you're enjoying this book half as much as I have enjoyed this book. I always love Maisey's books. I just wish the ending to this book would have been a little bit more detailed, like we found. You'll just have to wait until we get there. Page 280. Isn't yours real? Miriam asked. Her voice was low. Well, legal. That sounds... She cast a glance over at Iris, Pansy, and Rose. They weren't paying any attention to her. They were too busy putting on veils Pansy's head, and she was grateful for it. Ridiculous? Sammy asked. It's not. I mean, he's my best friend, or he's literally my best friend, but we're having a baby, so he's very traditional. And you're not? Miriam said. The other woman was probably about Sammy's age, but there was gravity to her that Sammy certainly did not possess. Her black hair was tamed into a bun, the deep rose-colored lipstick she wore matte and perfect and sophisticated. Her brown skin glowed with radiance of someone who had the patience from a daily skin regimen, something that Sammy didn't think she would ever have. She probably was very traditional, though Sammy didn't notice she didn't have a ring on her elegant finger. She did. However, her have a very nice manicure, which also spoke of patience and attention to detail. Not really, Sammy said. I've never believed in doing things for the sake of tradition. That's how people wind up miserable. And often they wind up miserable by bucking tradition for the sake of it, too. Nothing should be done just for the sake of it. A good point, Sammy said. Of course, she didn't know what the point of the point was, but she was committed to marrying Ryder, and everything was going to be fine, no matter what. There was no other option, which was great, and as far as she was concerned, she didn't need some polished-looking woman with better fashion sense than she had to start talking about her situation like she knew. She didn't know. Nobody did. She and Ryder weren't like anyone else. There were no comparisons to make, no precedent to set. Maybe that was just a little bit egotistical or something, but it was true. She and that pansy and her fiancé, West, had found some kind of amazing manic version of true love, and that was happy for them. She and Ryder knew each other. They had that benefit of years of caring for one another. They had practically were married, and she'd been long before they had ever been together. If any two people knew what to expect from a lifetime of commitment to one another, it was them. He was right. They knew each other too well to let themselves break apart over something as simple as boom boom. It just wasn't them. It wasn't in them. I'll just go try on the dresses. She was feeling sulky and resolved to find nothing by the time she stripped the poofy confection off and put the new dress on, but then something really unexpected happened, and when she stepped out of the dressing room and caught the look of her own reflection in the mirror, her breath got trapped in her throat. She didn't know she could look like that. The dress was simple, made of lace and beads clinging to her body rather than adding any volume to it. The kind of simplicity she hadn't known could come from a wedding dress. It made her feel traditional and herself all at once. And suddenly she could see it, really see it, walking down some sort of aisle toward Ryder as his bride, and he would be her groom. Was he going to wear a suit? Suddenly she wanted him to. Suddenly she didn't want to be the same kind of day that they had 100 times before, only vows instead of a barbecue. Suddenly she wanted a whole lot more. She looked over at Pansy, who was stunning in a dress made from soft flowing fabric that didn't dominate her petite figure, but made her look more like an absolute princess. That's wonderful, she whispered, looking over at her friend. Pansy looked back at her. Sammy, you look... That earned her attention of all the women, and suddenly she was being swarmed by all her friends, each clucking and touching pieces of the dress, and she unexpectedly felt part of something, traditions and a family in a way that touched her down to her soul. She hadn't thought that she wanted any of this, but to her surprise she did. They were going to be her sister-in-law, and they were significant. Sharing this with them was significant. She just hadn't expected it, not at all. She had expected, she didn't know, to feel above this, to feel like it didn't matter, not when she really she knew it, that he didn't love her, not really, sure as a friend, but it wasn't the same, it just wasn't. And there was that fine, it was just been fine, all of this had been fine, and until she had come here. Get the dress, Iris said. Her voice was soft. Yes, Rose agreed, get the dress. You're going to absolutely knock his socks off. And she could see it, hearts in Rose's eyes, because she wanted to match-make everyone and anything, and she seemed to truly believe that anyone could have a happy ending. It was more than Sammy could believe, but somehow, even though she didn't believe that she could have Normal and love, and even though she didn't believe this whole wedding thing was going to work, and didn't think it was going to be a marriage in the real sense, and didn't want to have all these feelings she would need to have to get those things anyway, suddenly she wished that she did. Suddenly, no matter what she felt, no matter what made her afraid, she wished that it could be more. But mostly it made her wish that she were different. It made her wish that she were a woman in the mirror, a girl getting ready for her wedding day, a bride. Well, she could be for one day, so why not embrace it? Pretend that she was a normal girl, pretend that she was living in the kind of romantic fantasy that she never imagined she could. Why couldn't she have the fantasy for one day? Pretend that she was a normal girl. Pretend that this was the fantasy. Her throat ached for it. Her body ached for it. Well, in one way, he was right. She did want this. She wanted the whole thing. The family, his family, yes. She did want them to be her family, too. She couldn't pretend that this wasn't the case. She wanted to dive head first into the whole thing all of a sudden, and maybe that was what she had been afraid of all along. Thank you, she said faintly. Do you want a veil? Iris asked. It was uncharacteristic to see even practical Iris with such pleasure over something as inconsequential as a bridal fashion, but it added to the well of feelings building in her chest. It added to quite a lot. Probably not, Sammy said. She had so much hair, and that was one thing she could have no desire to change much for her wedding. She wouldn't feel herself with blonde hair tamed in any fashion. She was accustomed to the way it was, or out of control, a bit on the feral side. Plus, Ryder liked it. He liked to run his fingers through it, liked to hold onto it while she was with him, liked to pull it sometimes. Quite frankly, the idea of leaving it loose for him felt... You're blushing, Rose said. No, I'm not, Sammy said. I don't blush. Except she did find that with him she did. For him she did. He was responsible for a whole lot of firsts, a whole lot of things that she wouldn't have said if it weren't for her, weren't possible or real. And yet, here she was. I have to try on that dress, Pansy said. This one isn't quite it either. Iris and Rose disappeared into the dressing room with her in the gown that apparently required multiple people to get off her. That left her alone with Miriam. I think the dress might be a bit too much, Sammy said. I mean, I don't want him to think that I'm taking this more seriously than he is. But you like it, Miriam said. For some reason, Sammy's throat got tight. I do. I like it a lot, but I don't want to want this. She blinked away tears. This poor near stranger had not asked Sammy to cry on her. I don't care more than he does. I don't want to care more than he does. He's marrying you, Miriam said gently. He must care an awful lot. I'm afraid it won't be enough. Sammy ended up being the only one left with a bridal gown, and the gown felt heavy. She didn't want to be in love, not at all. Love was such a weird thing, the kind that you wanted to give and get back. Friendship was different. You didn't wander around wondering if people you were friends with loved you, telling them you loved them and hoping for a reciprocal response, at least not with her friendships. You did that with parents. You did that with husbands in a traditional sense. She didn't want to do that, not ever. As a friend, she never wondered if Ryder's feelings for her were real. Heading into a love situation, she ignored the pain in her chest when she thought of it, because it was so nothing she wanted to get involved in, not in the least. Why add a worry to that plate of hers? Why, in the context of friendship, the two of them were so solid, unbreakable? Suddenly in her mind the scale of what they were appeared, and it seemed so much more precarious than she would like. If something was added to it, the thought of brought them off balance, that it would crack and crumble and dissolve. The thought of if she added to it hope of it, the demand for it, it finally would destroy all the things, good things that she didn't want, good things she found no security or satisfaction in, good thing her father had broken her of desire to ever enter into a conversation about love. Miriam was a nice woman, but she sold the wedding dress and she didn't have a ring on her finger. Sammy realized again that she didn't either, felt irritated about it. You told him you wanted to make your ring, she's thinking. Well, suddenly she didn't. Suddenly she wanted him to choose one and give it to her. She squeezed her eyes shut, her whole face feeling scratchy for some reason. Everything was fine, and she was not going to allow a bad case of bridezilla fever to infect her something that she was so certain about otherwise. She simply wasn't going to do it. Wanting a wedding and what their marriage were definitely two different things. She needed to be careful not to get them twisted up. She would have a wedding gown, and that was fine. She wanted one, so she had one. If she wanted to have a little dress-up and glamour situation happening, that was fine. She rationalized it as they wandered from car to Sugar Plum Fairies. The bakery had opened a couple of months back across the street from their favorite coffee shop. She decided that she was far more likely to find an answer in the cupcakes she ordered than she was in the tangle of thoughts whirling around in her mind. She didn't need to untangle them either, because it was one thing that was certain. It was Ryder. He was always certain, and he was always steady. She could count on him if nothing else, and that made her feel relieved indeed. Ryder didn't take asking for advice lightly. In fact, he never took advice, so the fact that he was doing it at all spoke volumes about how out of depth he felt. But he never been married before, and it hadn't hit him at the barbecue that he had to figure that out. He didn't start a work day on the ranch without a plan. He'd never gone to the football field without knowing the plays. He needed to figure out some husband plays. West was in love. West was Marion Ryder's sister, and West also had a degree removed from Sammy in a way that Logan's and the others weren't. And that was what brought him to the future brother-in-law's side at Gold Valley Saloon that evening, only a couple of days before his wedding. She says she doesn't want a ring, he said, but it just doesn't feel right to me. She said she didn't want a ring? West repeated his own words back to him, and Ryder found it astonishingly unhelpful. Yes, he said. Well, I mean, she said she doesn't want me to get her one. She wants to make it. You know, she's into all that artisan stuff. It's kind of her thing. Sure, West said, but a woman shouldn't make her own wedding ring. That's like making your own birthday cake, or hell, buying your own Christmas present, I guess. It's dumb, essentially, and I would think that most women would actually not be okay with that at all. But she said she was. Danger, Will Robinson, that sounds like one of those things. Sammy doesn't do that stuff. She doesn't play games. Maybe she didn't when she was your friend, but now she's your fiancée, the future mother of your baby, and that means games come into play. Are you telling me my sister plays games with you? Wes lifted a shoulder. We play games with each other, even if we don't mean to. That's how it all works sometimes, because suddenly when you get your feelings all in the mix, it's easier to play games than outright say it. Half the time I'm convinced that the game is with your own head. I bet she's not tricking you on purpose, but she's probably afraid to ask in case you don't want to do it. Look, that's all fine for you two, but she and we've been friends for about 1,000 years. West leveled a serious look at him. But now, you're more. Not really, Ryder said, ignoring the tightness in his chest. Seriously, you got the woman pregnant and you're marrying her, and you still going to say that there's nothing more between the two of you? Okay, it's more, but I guess accurately it's always been. It's not love. I mean, not in love, he clarified, but she's always belonged to me, and that doesn't make sense. I know that. It sounds like a whole lot of caveman thing, and it isn't. It's more than that. I've spent the past 17 years protecting her from the world, and now you have to protect her from you too, because I don't care if you think you're in love with her or not. There's a hell of a lot higher stakes when it comes to feelings than there were before you were engaged. There were before you were having a baby. That's just a fact. Ryder turned over in his head for a moment, and he was supposed that was probably true, and for some of it that hadn't really occurred to him since he wanted Sammy for quite some time, so the shift had made more uncovered things than he already known existed, rather than treated him to anything new. But he was already sure that Sammy herself had never even thought of him that way, so for her it was an entire sea change. And maybe that did require something on a different part on his part. Maybe it did require a shift, except I mean, we have great Boom Boom, Ryder said. Wes looked at him like he'd grown a second head that was dangerously stupid. You know, Wes said, I'm not an expert necessarily on the finer feelings of women, but being that I've only successfully managed to carry on a relationship with one, I mean, my relationship with my ex-wife was fine until she framed me for fraud and had me sent to prison, but I'm hoping for better with Pansy. So, you know, you can't take what I say with a grain of salt, but great Boom Boom isn't enough. It's not? No, Wes said, even if Ryder was not the kind of person who shared things like this, but he really did need to make sure because for the first time in his life he could remember that he had a pretty delicate situation he needed to talk over with someone, and Sammy wasn't available to have this discussion with. He could say anything to her. He always had the tough conversations and never strayed into the advice about Boom Boom or anything else of that nature, because the two of them had never really had that kind of relationship. And when it came to the actual quality of the Boom Boom, he was good, thanks. Even if he started again, you're the best Boom Boom she's ever had. Bro, West said, I'm the only Boom Boom your sister has ever had, and I still got her a ring. Ryder bristled up the back of his neck. Didn't need to know that. Hey, you brought it up, and you're bringing pretty dense for a guy who's essentially raised 3 girls. I would have thought you'd known better. Yeah, but it feels like something. Sure, Boom Boom is like that. It feels great and like something in the moment. And it takes things inside you and twists them up and makes them all feel bigger and deeper. Gets in you, hooks into you, links you into another person in a way that you can't be undone. Yeah, that was definitely true, and he would have said it if it wasn't, because before Sammy it never had been. But then there was the other thing. She had wound herself in his life around all that he was way before they ever started being together. There was a performance to who they were, and they always existed. Boom Boom had deepened that for him. It wasn't the thing that had created it. So I should buy her a ring, he said. That's what you're saying? Yes, Wes said, as big of a diamond as you can, because you're not just sleeping with her and marrying her. She's pregnant with your kid. She probably feels like crap. It would have to be an ethical diamond, or whatever they call it, he said, racking his brain to figure out how he would find one of those on a short notice. I imagine for Sammy it would. She's very aware of things to do with shiny rocks and stuff. It's what she does. Okay, I bet there's a place in town I can go to. I bet Willow Creek has something. Excellent. I suggest you get your butt over there bright and early. Definitely. And you should propose to her. I did, he said. I proposed to her, and that's why we're getting married so soon. Did you go down on one knee? I know you didn't give her a ring. Sounds like a pretty half-butt proposal. Well, it's different. Quit making it different. Give her both. Give her the different that you are, but give her the tradition, too. Because isn't she worth that? Who else is going to do it, Ryder? You think that some other guy is going to come propose to her in a couple years? He won't. Not if you don't screw it up. So if I were you, I would make sure that I was the man that gave her absolutely every damn thing, or expect someday she will go find somebody else who will. That stuck deep in his chest, lodged in a place that couldn't shake it free. You don't like that, West said. Good. So I suggest you make sure it's a non-issue. Ryder nodded and lifted his beer bottle to his lips. Okay, I can do that. Romance wasn't really his thing, never had been, but for Sammy he would do anything. And if West thought she needed some trappings in order to make this all feel real, he'd give her whatever the hell trappings she needed. He had never intended to propose to a woman in his life, and now here he's fixin' to have done it about 3 times, because the first time she refused him. The second time she accepted, but it hadn't been a real. So now he was going to set out to make one as real as he could. And he knew exactly where to source the help. I hope that you and Logan aren't busy tomorrow afternoon, he said. What do you have in mind? West said. He could see her suddenly so clearly. His Sammy in a flowing dress under a beautiful arbor, lots of flowing. That was Sammy. She was a fairy, and she should have a fairy wedding, and he didn't know why. He suddenly knew, only that he did. There's nothing sudden about it. No, knowing that she was 17 years in the making, and so this marriage. I'm going to need some help with some building. I think I've created a monster. With any luck, a monster who's going to be able to hang on to his marriage. Okay. The wedding was tomorrow, and Sammy was starting to feel jittery. Worse, was starting to avoid Ryder, because whenever she was near him, she was enervated. And like all of her anxieties had twined together and left her feeling completely drained and flat. She hated that. It had never been like that between them. She would have never thought that a friendship had spanned 17 years, her ridiculous rebellious phase, where she had basically kicked back against everything in the world just to test her freedom, his grief, and the stress that he felt over ensuring that all of his siblings and cousins made it to adulthood could possibly become so complicated. But it had. They had survived raging teenage hormones, only to be complicated, overtaken by the heat between them in their 30s. Now they're getting married because of a pregnancy that had made exploring the heat difficult. It just forced them into another new space entirely. They weren't just friends, they weren't just lovers. It was blending together, and It only got yet more blurry when he held her through the bouts of morning sickness, his touch intimate but not boom-boom wise. It made her chest ache in good ways. She didn't want to explore. She returned somewhat triumphantly to the camper that evening, stomped off when she saw a note pinned to the door. She pulled it off, reading Ryder's blocky handwriting immediately. Follow the trail. She looked around, didn't see anyone there. It was getting dark out and the sun was sinking below the mountains, the sky illuminated with gold. The trail! She looked down. Right next to her foot was a sugar cube. A small smile touched her lips. At the same time her heart crashed hard against her breastbone. He was baiting her. And in all their years of friendship she couldn't recall that happening. She picked up the first sugar cube, then the next, then started leaving them behind because that silly man put a surplus through the field, and they became more difficult to follow as the grass got taller, but she managed. And then in the distance she could see it, a big wooden frame wrapped in light, suspended high above everything else on the near horizon. White swatches of fabric were wrapped around the frame with flowers and lights entwined all around. It was magic. A fairy house right there in the field just for her. But they hadn't talked about doing anything like this. In fact, they hadn't been committed to standing out in a patch of dirt while Pastor Michael came and said all the right words. She quit looking at the sugar cubes and started to run. Her long skirt whipped against the grass as she did. Her hair was flying in the breeze behind her, and then she saw him standing in the center of the big, bright creation. She was glad she had run, because when she stopped about 10 feet away from him, she could pretend that the sickening thud of her heart was physical exertion and not from wondering what this was. He was standing there in a black t-shirt, black cowboy hat, and jeans, and suddenly she didn't even want him to wear a suit for their wedding. She wanted him like this, her cowboy, so stalwart and perfect. Her every cowboy fantasy, which, if it wasn't for him, she wouldn't have at all. For the first time she wondered if the real reason she had gone for men who were so opposite to Ryder was that anyone who wasn't Ryder would have only ever been a poor substitute. In the reality, that was what had been. Poor substitutes for the kind of man she never let herself want. No, not that kind of man. The man, because, oh, she never wanted to want him. Even now, looking at him standing there like this, she felt so stripped bare, so vulnerable, like he would be able to see all the soft, needy places inside her, places that she vowed she never would show anyone ever again. You made it, he said. She nodded wordlessly, and she was unable to find a way to get a speech through her tightened throat. Well, you left a pretty clear trail. I tried, he said. What is this? The light was continuing to ebb, and that made all the glow around the structure that Ryder stood beneath all the brighter. Did you make this? He shrugged a shoulder. I had a little help. It's beautiful, she said. Come here, he said. She found herself hesitant to do so, but he reached out his hand, and his eyes were intense as they stared into hers. She reached out slowly and took his hand. He pulled her beneath the lights against his chest, and then he did something she didn't expect. He started to sway like they were dancing. His hold on her was possessive and yet expert. Then he twirled her. Her skirt and her hair was flying around in a circle. Before he brought her back to his chest, she laughed breathlessly, and he continued to move with her, to no music at all. But she could feel the rhythm between them, the one established by her heartbeat moving in time with his. Yes, she could feel it, coursing through her like a current. This was like something else. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't sexuality, attraction. It wasn't even logical. It wasn't built around doing the right thing or looking in the right kind of way. He was simply holding her, dancing with her like he wanted nothing more than to exist in that moment, in that space. She didn't know when they stopped spinning, because her heart was still beating out of control, and it wasn't because she was out of breath, not from the dancing anyway. She whispered his name, and he kissed it off her lips, pulling her into taking it deeper. She wrapped him in completely, those strong arms around her, big hands pressed firm between their shoulder blades. She loved this, being utterly, completely surrounded by him. He was always making her feel safe, but now she felt invincible, with her guardian rock wrapped around her. Like it felt like there was nothing that could hurt her. Nothing but him. That thought chased her like an errant lightning bolt streaking across the dark sky, and she shuddered. He pulled back, looked down at her. Is this okay? It's beautiful, she said. Is it for our wedding? It can be if you want, but mostly it's for right now, for us and no one else. She couldn't understand that. This was just for a moment not in appearances, not forever, a moment for them. It all chased around in her head like foxes going after their own tails, and she couldn't grab a hold of any of it long enough to make sense of it. I need to ask you something, Sammy, he said. What? Hope burned bright, and her fierce was inside her, and she couldn't quite say why or what for, and all she knew was it was blinding and all-consuming and terrifying. It filled her, made her want to float in the air, to burst into a million sparking pieces, because her human body couldn't contain it all. She needed to become something else, something new, something his, maybe, or something more of her own. She didn't know. That was at the heart of all this, the journey that had been on the moment that she had opened her mouth outside the Golden Valley Saloon and told Ryder that she wanted to have a baby. On some kind of journey to herself, and she knew that she hadn't quite found it yet, and then suddenly that big mountain of man dropped to one knee in front of her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't even think around it. She'd never even imagined it. He had never even wanted to imagine him doing such a thing, because he was the kind of man who had to stand strong and tall for all of his life, a man whom absolutely certainly was essential, and something like this, getting down on one knee with him, a question in his eye, would never could be him. At least she would have said so. But there he was on one knee. It was something kind of mind-blowing. Then he reached into his denim pocket and pulled out a box, a velvet box, like one of those diamonds you see on the commercial on TV, where men always looked hopeful at the woman and the woman cried, and a velvet box that was so for the normal woman, who were cherished and cared for, who were normal enough to actually be in a commercial rather than being somewhere left of the center enough that they might never see themselves in anything except an eccentric caricature, the friend of the heroine, and never see the heroine as herself. It was what she always cast as, at least as her own mind, what she's always been, the friend who stood off to the side and gave their dramatic bad advice that led to eventually the heroine getting a ring, but obviously never the one actually getting it. She didn't know what to do, how to react, so she just stood there frozen until he opened it. "It's handmade," he said, "and I've been assured that the salt and pepper diamond there is ethically sourced. I don't know what all that means, Sammy, or full implications of it, but I know that it matters to you, and I thought if I was going to get you a ring, it had to be somehow be all the things that you were. It had to be beautiful and yet be unique. And it had to be the diamond, because even though this doesn't look exactly like you think when you say diamond, it's still traditional underneath all that. And yet it had to be somehow a ring that cared about the world and how it all worked and how all it connected, because that's how you are. So this was the best thing I could find." She examined it as he held it out to her. It was made with rose gold and a beautiful princess-cut diamond with colored flecks in it, which was all very trendy in handcrafted jewelry circles. And he was right. If there could have been a ring that came right out of her own heart, it would have been this one. She could have made it herself, one so perfectly, and the ring he found her was the one that really said something. That was a feat, one that only Ryder could have pulled off. "So I never really asked you, not properly, not like this, and I thought that I ought to have something to offer when I did it. Sammy, Samantha, will you marry me?" A laugh escaped her lips. It was either that or a burst of tears that started sobbing, and she didn't want to do that, because everything was so beautiful. He had made this. He had gone out of his way and found that ring, and now he was down on one knee, and she never felt more special or herself in her entire life. She wondered if maybe this was it. If maybe this was the journey she had been on to this destination. One that she'd never been able to see, because it ended with this, with being Ryder's wife, and it all seemed joyful now and not so frightening or traditional for the sake of it. Suddenly she wanted to have the ring on her finger, and she wanted to wear it, that wedding dress, more than anything else in the world. She wanted to see his face when she walked down the aisle toward him, and she hoped that it would be filled with... She blinked hard. "Yes," she said, "yes." He left out of breath, and she hadn't realized he'd been holding, and took the ring out of the box, sliding it slowly on her finger. Then he stood up and grabbed her and kissed her hard. "Good thing," he growled, "since we're getting married tomorrow." She laughed. "Yeah, I guess so. Sure am sorry that I went about this the wrong way at first, you know, beating my chest and not exactly being, I don't know, romantic." That was it, the word she'd been searching for earlier, the way he held her even when she was clothed, for the way he felt to lean on his shoulder, to be near him, to sleep next to him every night. His strong arm crossed her waist. His breath was on her cheek. "We've never been the romantic," she whispered, "friendly, sexual, not romantic." He cleared his throat. "Well, a wise man pointed out to me that if you don't get romance from me, you were never going to have it, or you were going to find a way with someone else, so I figured I better make some." It was an amazing thing, it truly was, because she would have romance, and she would have friendship and caring, and all that was very wonderful. But somehow she felt like a piece was missing. standing there with that gorgeous ring on her finger, and the momentary delight and the sense of completion she had only felt minutes earlier when it dimmed. What was wrong with her? She couldn't seem to find what she was looking for. She couldn't seem to put her finger on it. "Thank you," she said, smiling. She rested her hand on his chest, looked at the ring, and it glittered there on her finger. This moment felt big, and it felt good, it felt right, and for a brief segment of time she was happy to rest in that, happy to simply be. Because whatever would happen after this, she didn't know, and that giant well of everything that had opened up inside her was terrifying, terrifying in ways she couldn't quite define. But it was official now, and it was real. Tomorrow she was going to become Ryder's wife. And we'll pick up with the wedding day tomorrow. Please keep your social distance. Keep washing your hands. When you can't wash your hands, use that hand sanitizer. Keep wearing your mask. I don't care if you had your shot. Let's play it safe and not sorry. Furthermore, I wish you much joy, faith, happiness, and above all else, love. May you have prosperity in the bank as well as your heart. Remember, it's better to give than to receive. And God bless each and every one of you. Hope to meet you again tomorrow. God bless.